Okay, welcome. Let's get started. It looks like most people have signed on. We've got a big group today. About 90 total, if everybody shows up. I hope everyone had a good Memorial Day weekend and no rest for the weary. We're going to jump right into some of these changes that are being driven quickly from the federal government and the Department of Labor. And just some housekeeping things. We will, if you have a question, I've got Brooke from our marketing team in the room with me, so you can submit any questions
Doing great.
during the process. Let's submit all our questions through the chat, and we'll take care of those. And then at the end, we'll open it up to everybody can hit their microphones up at the end, and we will have questions from everybody at the end. And yeah, just this title slide here. Here we go again. And for those of you who have been in HR for a number of years, this will be reminiscent of some things that happened beginning in 2016. And we'll go through a little history lesson of what happened with the Fair Labor Standards Act. And really, this session is focused on those minimum requirements under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And today, yeah, we'll venture in. We're gonna go deep on the Fair Labor Standards Act and the recent employment law update. And this was all triggered just last month in April, following these final rules that were published from the Federal Department of Labor. So we'll talk about their published date, some ongoing changes that may happen, that these new final rules, I kind of get a kick out of the federal government that they always call these final rules and they're never final. So take that for what it's worth. We'll talk about timelines that will impact you and almost every employer, and possible changes that will start on July 1st, 2024. So 5 weeks from yesterday is that timeline. We'll have, and through this PowerPoint presentation, a roadmap regarding the steps that we can take, identifying the impact to our company and our employees, and perhaps showing some patience in this process and what happened last time in 2016. And then we'll talk about implementation. So very straightforward. Hopefully this is helpful. I want to start off with a short story. And this story is really about the public sector and what the public sector does for us, and also solutions for us as citizens, as employees, but also consequences, and quite often unintended consequences. So it was several years ago that my family, we moved to Draper, Utah, and we came to find out quickly that the elementary, it was a public elementary school for my two oldest sons, and my oldest son was about 10 at the time, and I think he was 9, and then my second son was about 7 at the time. What happened was we realized that in that district that we were not close to the school at all, and that perhaps our best possible solution would be to have our two boys ride the public school bus. And there were several other students in the neighborhood right there, and the bus stop was just a short walking distance from our home in Draper. So we thought, okay, let's do it. As school started, we took our sons down and we dropped them off at the bus, and they rode on the bus to school, and then they rode home at the end of the day. And it was one of those days where the timing was just right, and I was able to pick up my boys from the bus stop. I walked down and picked them up from the bus stop, and I was talking to Colby. Like I said, he was about 7 at the time. And I said, Colby, how was it? And he talked about school. And I said, tell me about riding the bus. This is the first time in his life that he he had ridden a school bus, and he said, well, it was great. It was fun. There was there were a lot of, he said it was fun. And quite often I would ask my kids, well, what did you learn? What did you learn? And he said, well, I learned some things today. He said, on the school bus, I learned that you should not stick up your middle finger and point it at someone, because that's a bad thing. And I said, well, Colby, that's a great lesson. Let's remember that. Let's not stick up our middle finger and point it at someone, that could be a bad thing. And I said, is there anything else you learned? He said, yes. I also learned that if you grab your tongue and hold on to your tongue and say the word apple, different words come out, but it's actually bad words. So those are the two takeaways that my son had from these public sector solutions and some unintended consequences. So you'll find that with our training today, that some of these changes can be good, they can be bad, but there's a lot of unintended consequences that come from these. So let's jump in. With these changes, it's estimated that nearly 4.25 million Americans may be impacted by the future changes, including the ones that are slated for this summer, and also the changes that will impact on January 1st of next year. Many workers may end up, and I put the word may in there, nothing's final until it's final. But they may end up moving from an exempt level, meaning the word exempt just means exempt from the overtime rules of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, and we've had these exemptions all along. The legislation is extremely old, but there's exemptions that some people can just be paid salary, and you don't have to pay them an overtime rate, that 1.5x rate. And this move, it could be viewed as positive or negative. And we'll talk about that. Anytime you're moving somebody from an hourly position salaried position to an hourly position could have impact and timekeeping, and we'll talk about all that. First, I want to jump in and I want to look at Fair Labor Standards Act basics, just the basics of this law to give us all a foundation of what this law is about. So, these are some of the oldest employment laws on the books. It was actually, the act was created in 1938, so well over 80 years ago. And the act covers overtime rules. For the first time ever in our nation, the work week was set up, and a standard work week of 40 hours. And it's interesting that employers are allowed to define the work week. And what I mean by that is, and you're allowed to, and you're required to. Most companies that I work with have a defined work week of Sunday morning at 12:01, and that work week will loop around to Saturday at midnight. It's exactly 7 days. And we talked a little bit about this at our GBS conference, that you're not allowed to balance work weeks. So let's say your company, you're paid every 2 weeks. You define that work week as a set 7-day schedule. You can't have somebody work 60 hours the first week, 20 hours the second week, and then combine it and say, oh, that's 80 hours, no overtime. That's not allowed. Overtime is based on that work week. And in that example, if someone worked 60 hours in that first week, well, they're entitled to their 20 hours of overtime because they exceeded 40. And like I said earlier, the act does allow for exemptions from overtime for managers and leaders and IT professionals and administrative individuals, providing they meet the salary requirements, the compensation rule, and the duties test. And a lot of times those duties tests will look at the decision-making ability of that manager. Are they forever? It's looked at, does this manager have the ability to make substantial decisions for the company? And that doesn't just mean monetary decisions, but it could be hiring and firing. That's one good example. So your managers that are allowed to be part of the hiring and firing process, and they manage teams, are typically going to be exempt from any overtime rules. With that said, I've got a couple of clients who pay all of their employees, including the CEO, an hourly rate. They pay them hourly, and if overtime kicks in, they pay the overtime. It's very rare. So with over 1,800 clients, I've just got two that I can think of that pay everybody an hourly rate, but that's legal. You can do that. So the Fair Labor Standards Act also addresses final pay rules. And I get this question a lot, that we have an employee that left and they owe us some money. Either they kept some tools or they have a laptop or a cell phone. They owe us money. Can we just withhold their final check until they get that money or that equipment back to us? And the answer is yes and no. One of the rules under the Fair Labor Standards Act is that final pay should not go below the federal minimum wage for active hours worked. So in this scenario, for active hours worked, if someone on their final paycheck, if they worked 20 hours, and let's say to make the math easy on me, let's say they make $27.25 an hour. And it's in a state like Utah or Idaho where the minimum wage is set with the federal rate of $7.25 an hour. You would have to go in as a payroll or HR, you would go in and you would calculate, okay, 20 hours worked, and we would calculate that $140, $145 that goes to, would have to be cut, a check would have to be cut and given to that person. That remaining money, which is $20 an hour, if they've got 20 in there, it could be $400. You could put a hold on that $400. But that's that rule on the final pay, that the employee needs to walk away with at least federal minimum wage for any active hours worked. So it gets more and more difficult the less hours that employee has on the final paycheck. Okay. Also, the Fair Labor Standards Act is an area where we need to, as HR professionals, we need to keep an eye on the risk associated with the Fair Labor Standards Act, that wage claims are increasing. And the DOL has said in the last 12 months that wage claims are an enforcement priority. And we're seeing increased litigation over wages, concerns about remote workers, having clear policies. When does that remote worker start work and stop work? And how do we track that in the system? So these new claims are that remote workers are saying, wait, I'm paid hourly. And this doesn't, the risk is not there for exempt employees. But if it's an hourly person and they're accepting phone calls and working after hours, that should be calculated in. And there needs to be a clear setup of tracking the start and stopping time of any work. Also, there's been some claims, and these are all coming in as either class action claims or collective action claims. So they're coming in as class action claims and collective action cases that can be, the dollars can really add up. If you've got 100 people working in customer service and you're not paying them for the time that the computer boots up, maybe you have slow computers. They all work on a computer. They come in and they sign in or clock in through the computer, but it takes that computer 6 minutes to boot up. Times 100 employees, that could be overtime. There could be a collective action case against your company to say, oh, that's 600 minutes a day, and it can just escalate and become tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars very quickly. So keep an eye on that. And here's what's driving our call today, is that the DOL is on the move once again. And I want to go through this quick history lesson, because it was only 6 years ago, of what happened last time. And will this be an indication of what happens this time? We'll see. So if we go back to May 17th, 2016, the DOL again published what they entitled a final rule, and they communicated an increase of the salary threshold to over $47,000. This is an annual rate. And then they provided a 7-month window. So they were going to allow people until December of 2016 to prepare for the increase, because the increase was moving up from 23,000 and change to over 47,000. Then on September 20th of 2016, 21 separate states filed a lawsuit against the DOL. So all of these states were seeking to halt the final rule from the DOL or delay the injunction. These cases were combined on this date and presented in a hearing to Judge Mazant in Texas District Court. So we started with May, we went to September, and then November 22nd, this is just 9 days before the scheduled implementation of the new salary threshold. That same federal court judge in Texas issues a nationwide preliminary injunction blocking the United States Department of Labor. So even though they had that 7 months, it took them until the last 9 days before it was blocked by the judge. So the Texas judge, the following year, August 31st, it was tied up in the courts. August 31st, the following year, the judge invalidates the proposed changes, and it was that same judge. Then fast forward to September 24th, 2019, the DOL backs off and says, okay, we've got a different final rule that's issued. And they gave a little over 3 months implementation window, and they said, okay, we're going to meet in the middle, and we'll have an effective date of January 1st, 2020. And the minimum was raised from 23,600 to the current, what it is today, at 35,568. So it's far below that projected number of 47,000. That's our quick history lesson for today of what happened last time. And then it became law, and it became effective January 1st, 2020. So fast forward to today. Here's what happened. So last month, April 23rd, another final rule is published by the DOL. Once again, changing the number for the minimum threshold, and also changing the numbers for the highly compensated employees, changing that amount. So yeah, just last month this happened. Next slide. So as we discussed before, the current threshold is at 35,568, and currently the highly compensated employees, that number is at 107,432. The thing you need to remember about the HCEs, the highly compensated employees, is under the and that term, that acronym, is used in different parts of employment law. Okay. It's used in 401k calculations as well. This is separate. This is just for the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what this means is that as of today, if you have an employee making over 107,432, that at that level, that the employee does not need to go through the category testing, the duties testing, that they've passed that highly compensated employee's threshold, and they can be placed in a salaried position. No other questions asked. Okay. Next one here. So here are the changes. Here are the changes that we're looking at. Coming as soon, like I said, 5 weeks from yesterday, July 1st, 2024. This is what the final ruling has said, that the salary threshold is set to increase to $844 a week, or an annual rate of $43,888. So a substantial increase. And it would move the HCE exemption up to almost 133,000. Okay. Then built into this final rule are these recurring, another increase that's scheduled for January 1st, 2025. That increase would also go up in a substantial manner to $58,656, so almost $60,000 and the HCE would increase to 151. That's how it's published. That's what it looks like today. And I say that because these things are fluid and can change. The threshold, the other thing that happens is that every 3 years, starting in January 1st, 2027, and every 3 years after that, they're going to take Department of Labor statistics and they'll realign it every 3 years to be tagged to the 35th percentile of weekly earnings for the lower threshold, the salary threshold, and then the HCE exemption would be bumped up to the 85th percentile. So as increases in overall national salaries increase, it would increase every 3 years, the way it's written today. Okay. So I get this question a lot that, okay, we've got an individual and their salary is set and they get this amount of salary and they're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. But can you use a bonus calculation as part of that overall salary? And the answer is yes, you can, but it's limited. So the new rules are about that federal minimum amount. But the old rules of bonus calculation for the addition of non-discretionary bonuses and payments, those are unchanged. So these bonuses can include commissions or bonuses where the employee meets a set criteria. It's not just kind of a freebie holiday bonus that they would get. It can occur annually or shorter intervals, but it has to be assessed and set at a criteria that the employee has to reach. The bonus or commissions may be used to satisfy 10% of the overall salary threshold. Now, I've got a lot going on in this slide and a lot about the bonuses. We have an example on the next slide that'll show you exactly what I mean by this. And the bonuses must be cash equivalents only. So it cannot be stock options or non-cash compensation. That could not be used in the calculation. So here's the example. You have an employee and we're gearing up and we know that July 1st that number is going to move up, but to 43,888. Or we think it might. Sorry to be nondescript, but it might change. So the annual today, that employee's annual base salary is 39,000, and that employee gets a 15% bonus. So at the end of the year, they get let's say it's annual, and they get $5,850. They achieve the full bonus of 15%. However, remember under the rules on the last slide, that employee can only use, or the company can only use 10% of the overall base salary toward the calculation. So the applied bonus would only be $3,900, 10% of the annual salary. The total compensation then is 39,000 plus the 5,850 is 44,850. However, only 42,900 is measured under the calculation. So 10% is the maximum dollar amount, but this employee would still fall below that July 1st threshold of 43,888. So a lot of moving pieces on this, but remember, you can apply 10% of their bonus, providing it meets the qualifications to the amount to get them over the threshold. So I've put these slides together of the things that you need to be thinking about over the next 5 weeks. And these steps are just laid out. And again, you'll get these steps in the PowerPoint that's going to be delivered. The first one is focused on data. Step 2 is identify. Step 3 is educate. Step 4 is meet with the employee, and step 5 is make the changes. And it says July 1st on here. We'll talk about that. So step number 1, you want to pull the data from your HR software. You want to find all the exempt, first you want to find all the exempt employees earning an annual amount within that range. An annual amount plus the 10% bonus. So how many people do you have in that range of 35,568 to 43,888? Also, it's a good idea while you're in the system and pulling that data, you might as well pull those numbers. And I've got the number wrong there. All those who earn 45,000 to the 58,000, because remember, then you're putting together a group of people that might possibly be impacted in the January 1st group. Okay, so step one is just collect that data from your HR software. Step number two, identify the total number of employees. And also, I think it's important to look at how many employees are within $1,000 of 43,888. And it's kind of a random number that I've chosen, but if they're within $1,000, it's possibly someone will need to think about of what do we do? Do we move them to hourly or do we increase them? And then determine the location and remember to consider the state laws. We'll go through these in a few slides. There are 5 different states that have already increased this number ahead of any federal increases. So we'll talk about those states. Step number 3, with these employees who may be impacted, we need to educate. So we're going to plan on educating those, especially that first group, if they're impacted by the July 1st deadline. So we'll put a plan together. I would be patient about when I'm going to talk to those employees. And that's the decision that we're going to make. Will you increase their salary or will you move them to hourly? And how close are they to that limit of 43,888? And it may only be a 6-month solution with bigger numbers coming January 1st. And number 3 on this education step is to have the meeting, inform the employee that this decision is being driven by federal law, and this decision is not meant to penalize them in any way. You don't want to come across as the bad guy on this. Step number 4 is meet with them. Meetings can take place in person or via video calls. I prefer an in-person meeting or even a telephone communication. I'm trending away from having just direct video calls with employees, because what I keep seeing on social media is employees will take their phone, turn it around and hit record, more so in layoffs and termination meetings, but they record their entire meeting and then they post it to social media. So consider that risk of employees recording that full meeting as you meet with employees over compensation. You could also choose to wait until June 30th or even later to meet with any employees, because the states may come in, they may file a suit, a federal judge could come in. You could wait until the 12th hour to meet with employees, and I'll talk about that date and how we might have even longer to wait. And step number 5 is implementation. What you'll do is implement the changes in your payroll system. You'll consider the payroll period. So July 1st is a Monday, and depending on your own payroll cycle, you may be able to delay till July 15th or sometime in July as payroll hits in mid to late July. And I say that patience may pay off, because last time what happened in 2016, 2017, companies went out and they gave increases, sometimes big increases to employees over that early threshold of 47,000. And then everything was reeled back by the courts and the states, and the threshold was never near that. But it's very hard to reel that back in after you've granted large salary increases to employees. And when any changes are implemented, I recommend that you memorialize or you document the changes as part of the employee file with a payroll change form, electronic or hard copy. And as you know, that's required in some states like New York. You would have to have that written copy, would have to also go to the employee. So those are the 5 steps to compliance. So question here, if you have a salaried employee who is making $43,500 annually, and we know that on July 1st, that threshold will just move up to $300 to $400 higher than that. Well, what would you do that with that employee? I think most employers in that situation would bump that person up to either 43,888 or 43,900, moving that up and keeping them, at least for 6 months, keeping them in that situation where they're over the federal threshold and you wouldn't have to change their status. These are delicate things to talk about with employees. So I encourage you from early on to be transparent in your communications. Let the employees know what's driving this, that it's the Department of Labor. Some employees, many employees, if you move them from a level of exempt or salary to an hourly, there's that sense of demotion. Oh, all of a sudden I have to clock into a time clock. I don't have the flexibility that I had last week when I was salary. Now I'm hourly again, and it feels like that sense of demotion. So be careful with that. Also discuss with them year over year pay. And maybe because of the numbers, you have to demote them to hourly. But you talk to that employee and say, hey, let's look at last year's pay. And last year's overall pay was X amount. That we as an organization, we want to see you grow and discuss the 2023 pay, and to say at the end of the year, we want to see you well above that 2023 pay. So we're still going to work with you to develop you and get that year over year increase. There also could and should be a discussion of overtime, that if that person is taken from salary or exempt level to hourly, you need to talk about overtime and what your policy is in your handbook, that overtime needs to be approved. That person who was a manager yesterday, tomorrow they're going to be hourly and they have to get overtime approved by their manager. And then you would also address any new, that it may be years and years that they've ever had to do timekeeping on a time clock, and that they might be, you might need to bring them up to speed on timekeeping practices, or whether it's biometric or you've got a badge swipe system, whatever you guys are using. And remind them that this is not a result of their poor performance. This is a result of federal DOL changes. Okay. I want to stop right there for a second and let's open it up before we get to the, let's stop halfway and let's see if there's any questions going on.
I do have one more question.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. So when you mentioned trying to hold off because, changes can be made up to July 1st, I checked the calendar for my payroll cycle.
Yeah.
And our payday is on the 5th, which means
oh yeah.
So my last day really would be like the 1st, because of
you would,
the way
to pay them on the 5th, you would have to have those changes implemented by the 1st on the Monday, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because because you pay on the 5th, and you'll have to have all those changes in there. So you'll still be okay. It's really a short. Go ahead. Yeah, so I guess because I already looked at my list of people and it's like pretty short for the July one. So I guess more so yeah, I don't think I have a big issue with that one, actually.
And to be honest, if the federal government or if a district court or the states come in and they are able to delay what's happening, that will happen on or before June 28th, that Friday. It just will. It won't happen on the Monday. So yeah, if nothing had been delayed or stayed or halted by June 28th, my advice and what I would do with my company would be to move forward and make those changes if it's not stayed. So good question. Good job of looking at your looking at your policy and how that plays out. So I call this my balancing pay example. This is just a mindset of, okay, what are we going to do now that we have someone who, and this person would be well below that new threshold. They're making $40,000 a year. And let's say they're running a small restaurant and they're working 50 hours a week, no bonus. So if I calculate that out, 50 hours a week times 52 weeks is 2,600 hours that person works a year. So really, at the end of the day, they're making $15.38 an hour. But if I just do that easy math and say, okay, I'm going to move this manager now, and I'm just going to put them at $15.38 per hour. Well, that would result in straight time pay over the next year of almost $32,000. But the additional 10 hours of overtime per week, because now I'm moving them to an hourly position, would result in 520 hours paid at time and a half, 1.5x. They would be making just over $23 an hour for the overtime hours. And the total amount would be $43,986. In effect, I've just given this person a $4,000 raise. Unless I go back in. So it becomes a challenge. It either becomes a production challenge where this employee will have to do more in less hours, or a cost challenge. If they keep working those 50 hours a week, it's going to cost me as the business owner almost $4,000 in the coming 12 months. So will you reduce their wage, or can you? Because they're not really set up at a wage today. They're not guaranteed that $15.38 an hour. But will you reduce the wage? And some of you may say yes, and some may say no. Maybe you reduce that wage to $14.60 an hour, and that helps you balance back to the 40 or 41 or 42,000 and keep it away from that huge increase, that 10% increase. It could also mean wage compression issues, that there may be frontline. This may be and is likely a manager or a team lead or a supervisor, and now we bump them to an hourly wage. Well, what if there's someone on the team reporting to them that makes over $15.38? Now we've got these wage compression issues that we've got to deal with and look at. But maybe, if it's that, all the things that we have to look at are there. Here's another one. This one is just a 40-hour-a-week employee. This is an office manager. And the way their job is set up, that they never exceed 40 hours a week. This person works 40 hours a week. Even though they're being paid salary, they work 40 hours a week, no problem, all the time. It's 40 hours. It never goes over 40. So their pay is, today, let's say their pay is $46,000 annually with no bonus. And they meet the duties test, and they are exempt today, and we don't have to pay them overtime. So this employee, as of July 1st, they'll still be over the threshold, and it's not going to be an issue, but they'll be far below that January 1st threshold. So two questions. This summer, is there risk? No, this summer there would be no risk, and I wouldn't change this person. I would keep them as a salaried and exempt employee. And I would also argue that in January of 2025, there's no risk there either. The risk in these movements happen when the employee is working the overtime hours. And this person never exceeds 40, and there's not going to be risk in January of 2025. So something to look at. Remember that truly that risk comes into play, and a claim coming in from an employee would be entitlement to overtime pay that they've missed, and this person never exceeds 40. Here's the challenge. I took you through that little history, that history lesson, and what happened in 2016. And as you looked at that, it was really 3.5 years before the compliance date of January 1st, 2020 kicked in. We're facing a much shorter window. Now, this was announced in April. I was watching last week, all through the week, to see if the states would file a lawsuit or if a district judge would initiate an order, and that hasn't happened yet. So now we're down to just 5 weeks left. You remember in the 2016 comparison, there was 7 months for the states and for the district courts to respond. So it's a much shorter window. Will individual states respond before July 1st? it's likely and will Texas take another shot? It was a district judge out of Texas, perhaps. So we need to keep our eyes on that, and we'll have communications come out if we hear anything. And let me switch gears a little bit. There are other parts of the Fair Labor Standards Act that are often overlooked or forgotten, and we're going to take a look at those. Remember that there's also enterprise coverage rules that the organization, to fall under the Fair Labor Standards Act, must exceed 500,000 income annually. So that's interesting, that if you're a tiny corporation and you're not making over 500,000 annually, there's some exemptions there, and the FLSA standards would not apply. Now, for nonprofits, they look at it this way, that only the activity that's in competition for a profit. So there's still that $500,000 threshold, but it would have to be that part of the business where they compete with for-profit businesses. So my example that I like to use is the Kidney Foundation. The Kidney Foundation is not for profit. However, they have a vehicle donation program where you can donate your vehicle to the Kidney Foundation, and then as part of their business, they turn around and sell those vehicles. Well, by virtue of them selling those vehicles, they're in direct competition with for-profit businesses, and if that exceeds 500,000 in a year, then they fall under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Also, just a reminder, hospitals and government agencies also must meet the FLSA rules. Okay, a lot going on that slide. Also, outside sales. Now, because this legislation is so old, that there's special interests that have been adopted throughout the years, where some job titles even and some jobs have been allowed to be exempt, and others have not been allowed to be exempt. So typically, outside sales individuals are exempt from the overtime related to the Fair Labor Standards Act, so they can be salaried. Whereas inside salespeople working in the office and inside sales are typically hourly positions. To qualify for the outside sales exemption, both of the following must be met. Number one, the employee's primary duty must be making sales, obtaining orders or contracts paid by the client or customer. And number two, the employee must be customarily and regularly engaged away from the employer's place of business, which that number two has increased over the years as more and more, especially salespeople, are working remote. So that's the outside sales exemption, just that slide. And one more, this slide is crazy to me. Who is not included in the Fair Labor Standards Act? And the first two, I understand those. Doctors and lawyers are not included, and they do not get overtime pay. But teachers, I've never understood this one. For teachers who have a primary duty to teach, tutor, instruct, or lecture students as part of an educational establishment, the Fair Labor Standards Act does not apply, meaning the overtime rules don't apply. So a teacher can work 60 hours a week and there wouldn't be overtime. But most often with teachers, there's also contractual language that they don't work under the normal at-will employment, that quite often there's contractual things there. And you guys know that. And then these others, here are the laundry list. I'm sorry it's so long. There's so many of them, but these have been carved out through the years as not eligible for overtime. So it can be farm workers, parts employees, and mechanics, but they would have to be employed by an automotive dealership. Commissioned sales employees in auto, truck, trailer, farm implements. It also could be announcers, like radio announcers, TV announcers, news editors, broadcasting employees. That just seemed random to me. Domestic workers living in the employer's residence. Employees of the motion picture theaters, and interstate commerce employees who fall under the Motor Carrier Act. So some weird carve-outs there. Let me talk first about the minimum wage. Minimum wage does tie into this because it drives overtime pay. So first, let's look at the minimum wage. Then we'll look at the 5 states that have driven up this FLSA minimum. So here are the top 7. I pulled these, and these are the ones that are at $14.30 an hour or more. So we've got Arizona. The 2 highest are California and New York. I think the District of Columbia might be even higher than them, but I pulled a state list. So you could, if you've got employees in Washington, D.C., you could check that, but I think that's over the 16. But some pretty high numbers here. And if you look at that, also there are 20 states that maintain the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Now they can maintain that. You won't hire anybody at $7.25 an hour, but some interesting numbers there. And most of these numbers now at the state level, especially these states, are pegged to increases that happen every January 1st. So here are the 5 states that have already increased their FLSA minimums. So starting off with California, they are up now, and most of these happened on January 1st of this year, $66,560. So that for your employees in California, you needed to be thinking about this long ago, because the state increases, you can't have anybody whose salary or exempt level under this $66,560. Colorado is moved up to $55,000 even this year. And actually, I think the number was $54,998, but I think I rounded up to the $55,000. In the state of Maine, the number is at $41,401, which that could be surpassed by the federal level if we keep that number on July 1st. And New York, so if the worker is in New York City, in Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, the number is 62,400. All other New York workers are at 58,458. And coming in at the lead here is the state of Washington, 67,724.80. So some choices. We talked about it earlier, but that's where you guys come in. You have the choice with your management teams and executive teams. Do you increase the salary to the new threshold? Do you move the employee to hourly and pay the overtime? Do you move the employee to a lower hourly wage and allow the overtime? And there's a note in here that this is not viewed as retaliatory by the DOL. So you're not going to open up a discriminatory claim by moving them lower, because the overall numbers would put them higher. We saw that in our example. Or do you consider the use of part-time employees to fill the production gap if you've got to move somebody from 50 or 55 hours a week down to 40 hours a week? So lots of choices. And I stated this, changes could be coming as soon as 5 weeks from yesterday. As we discussed in the course today, the other standards of the Fair Labor Standards Act remain in place. The HCE threshold is also set to increase. All of us should be prepared to implement possible changes, and it's a short timeline. And the July, some attorneys are saying that no, it's going to be struck down. A federal district court will come in and strike it down and delay everything. Other attorneys are saying the timeline is so short that they think, other attorneys are saying that July 1st will stay in effect, and that the one that will be battled will be that January 1st of next year. And Joe, none of these changes are happening in the Netherlands, by the way, which is the birthplace of Alex and Edward Van Halen. So I just thought I'd bring that up.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, they're okay in the Netherlands, although the overall taxes are much higher.
You have one question in the chat.
All right, well, let's see. It sounds like I've got a chat question. Can you talk a little bit more about which nonprofits are covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act? To my knowledge, it's any, well, they do that calculation. So your operating costs are 1.2 million, but you would look at, out of that 1.2 million, is there 500,000 in revenue that's generated from competition with any for-profit business. That's the definition that I know about. So it could very well be that your nonprofit would be not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. But also, Adam, if you'll hit me up with an email too, I think that's one that we need to dig into deeper and determine that. There's also nonprofits who have made the decision that, oh, hey, we're still going to mirror what standard jobs do, and we're going to apply overtime, and we're going to voluntarily do it. But that's it. It's a great question. We'll dig into that deeper. Thanks for the question. Is there a way to estimate what the next threshold increase could look like? Not that I know of. Just looking at the past, you know, from 2016, they came out. We were at 23,000, and they came out with 47,000, and then they kind of met halfway. That what ended up happening was they met in the middle, and it was 35, almost 36,000. So it's keeping our eyes on what happens. I am surprised this time that there was such a short. It takes a long time to implement these things. Imagine if you had 200,000 employees. It's a long time to do this. So some of a district court could come in and say, hey, there just wasn't enough time given, that we need to push pause on this. You cover again when other compensation can be counted. Yes, you're correct. It has to be what's defined as a non-discretionary bonus. It's not just that the company has come in and said, well, hey, we like you, we love what you did, here's your annual bonus of $1,000. It's not tied into anything. Every employee in your same group will get this $1,000 bonus. It's got to be tied. It's got to be a non-discretionary bonus. So you can pull up and you can pull that full definition of a non-discretionary bonus. And remember, it has to be a cash type bonus. It can't be lodging or anything like that. If we have a job grouping that is currently exempt, and the minimum of the salary range for that job grouping will fall below the new salary threshold, will we have to change everybody in that job category? You could create kind of a new hybrid job category, one that would be an hourly position and one that would be exempt position. But you're right, that salary threshold would have to be above the new federal threshold. Currently, there are some employees that will be above the new threshold and some that will fall below. Yeah, that's tricky, especially if they're in multiple states. So you could navigate that by creating two independent job groupings, and one for hourly and one for salary is kind of the logical way I see around that. Let me stop share and get everybody pulled back up. All right, well, I think that's the end of it. Thanks, everyone. Oh, wait, was there one more question in the chat? No, it's just Becky. Becky, thank you as well. Have a great day and have a nice shortened week. It's already Tuesday.
Thank you, Joe.
Take care, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.